Yes, that's the spirit, android! Never say die!
Long ago, in the distant year of 2005, Dragon Ball Z was finally starting to be recognized for the global phenomenon it really was. And what better demonstration of this fact could we use than a Western studio acquiring a license to develop a game based on the anime? Whereas previous major titles based on the series, such as Ultimate Battle 22 and the Budokai series, were all developed by Japanese studios, this little gem was carved out by a studio founded right here in the old US of A. A studio you may even recognize from their recent work on a certain Wizard game. That's right, Avalanche Software made a Dragon Ball Z video game, and not only that, but an incredibly unique one that challenges every prior idea of what a Dragon Ball game should even look like, incorporating various new ideas and concepts that we'd never seen in a Dragon Ball game before, and still haven't seen since. Too bad it kinda sucks. Dragon Ball Z SAGAS is a beat-em-up pseudo Collect-A-Thon video game released on March 22nd, 2005 for the Microsoft Xbox, the Nintendo GameCube, and of course, the Sony PlayStation 2. The combat consists of mixing melee combat with energy blasts whilst balancing your ki energy and integrating various combo attacks into your moveset. While the gameplay loop is centered around collecting all of the capsules hidden around the level as you progress through it and taking out whatever enemies get in your way. Unfortunately, it's not a super good game, but I did actually have a lot of fun with it. There are a ton of things about SAGAS that were very novel at the time, not least of which is the fact that it bothered to incorporate one of the movies into a critical component of its canonical story mode. I'll talk more about that later. The footage on screen is from the PS2 release of the game, of course, but I did want to quickly point out the fact that this is actually the only Dragon Ball game to ever be released for the original Xbox, which makes it more of a novelty than it already was. So if you only had access to an Xbox and were a fan of Dragon Ball Z back in the day, then this was it. This was all you had to play, so it's pretty cool that at least one of these Dragon Ball games actually did make it to the old Xbox back in the day. If the gameplay has seemed a little familiar to you, then you may have played an old game called Tak and the Power of Juju, a game which I somehow have known existed for years but do not have the faintest clue of what it is. Research into this game, however, reveals that it was developed on top of the Tak engine to accomplish, so I guess if you're a fan of that game, then you might like this one too. I know I did. Yeah, in spite of saying that this isn't a very good game, which it's not, I actually really loved it. I was having a blast pretty much the whole time I was playing, and even found myself looking forward to playing more in between sessions, which speaks volumes in my opinion. Yes, I can recognize that this game is objectively pretty bad, and I can even remember not loving it myself way back in the day as a kid when I played it for the first time, but firing it up now and running through its various offerings, I genuinely really loved it. If you're here to see me talk negatively about this game like so many others have, then I can tell you right now that it's not going to happen. That isn't to say I'm going easy on it though. I will cover the various pitfalls and mistakes this game makes, but I'm also going to cover all of the things I enjoyed about it too. So with that said, let's get into this. One of the only Western developed Dragon Ball Z games ever made, Dragon Ball Z SAGAS. Much like the name suggests, the story mode of SAGAS is spread out across 7 chapters appropriately referred to in-game as SAGAS. Each chapter is made up of multiple individual levels to play through, with exception of one saga only having one level to it. The length of these levels and subsequent sagas can vary pretty greatly too, with some taking roughly 10 minutes and others taking nearly an hour depending on the status of your character at the time. Throughout these 7 sagas, the game takes us through the anime's major story beats, starting at the Saiyan Saga and ending on the Cell Saga with the final showdown between Gohan and Cell. Yeah, we're looking at another title that completely ignores the existence of the Buu Saga again, which is a really strange decision. In my coverage of Budokai 1, I talked about that game having left out the Buu arcs too, and got a lot of comments saying that the reason was an attempt on the Japanese studio part to avoid spoiling the series for overseas audiences, as the show was still airing and had yet to resolve. I'll entertain that explanation for Budokai 1, but no such excuse exists for SAGAS, as it was released years after the series had finished and on the heels of Budokai 3 no less. The only explanations I can fathom for this are budget or sequel bait. I think it's likely that the studio simply didn't have the budget to make all of the additional models and environments that would be required to adapt the Boo arcs, and figured the Cell Saga was a great place to end the game. It's also believable that they hoped in the event that the game was well received enough to warrant a sequel, they would have the Boo arcs to entice players back into their world again. Honestly, it's probably some of both. That said, what the game fails to deliver on with later sagas, it actually kind of makes up for with the inclusion of some incredibly unique levels in their place that add an immense amount of novelty to this game that most other Dragon Ball games simply do not have. Those being Yardrat and the Future Trunks timeline. It may only be for one mediocre level, but the addition of Yardrat is actually really cool to me, if only for the sheer rarity of the idea. You won't see many other Dragon Ball games bothering to include Yardrat of all places, much less let you fight against one of the natives there who trains Goku in instant transmission. I mean, this barely looks like a Dragon Ball game right now, but I kind of love it, even if it plays terribly. And it's not just Yardrat. Sagas also incorporates the history of Trunks movie into the canon of its own storytelling, allowing players to experience multiple levels in his dark future timeline, even letting us face off against androids 17 and 18. I loved this movie growing up, so naturally one of the only things I remembered about this game was the fact that it let me play these levels. In fact, when I thought of sagas, these levels were the first thing that would come to my mind because I thought it was so cool. Although the fact that they didn't let us play a level as Gohan here was a poor decision since they bothered to model him and program him as a playable character already. All they needed to do was remix the assets from one of the Trunks levels into a different layout and implement a Gohan only level. I know that he's playable as a co-op character, but I think it would have been cool to give him his own future timeline mission is all. Don't worry, I will talk about the co-op later. In spite of that, however, I really love that the team cared enough to cover the future timeline events like this. One of the places where it really feels like they cut some corners, however, is with these end-of-level videos. It's cool that they got the narrator from the series in on this, but what we get is just a bunch of paneled clips from the anime moving around the screen. I appreciate the creativity of utilizing this when they probably didn't have the resources for cutscenes, but at the same time, I think I'd rather have just had like a static image or two instead. This just feels manic at best and a tad lazy at worst. Whoever put them together did a good job, mind you, but it just feels a little cheap to me is all. I can't say the same about the voice acting, however, as all of that is top-notch. The Funimation VAs are back for this one, and they all nail their roles, same as always. I mean, they'd been portraying these characters for years already at this point, so it's not a surprise that they crushed it here too. Of course, they always do, though, and hearing their voices portraying their respective characters just feels natural to me at this point. Speaking of characters, Sagas has an interesting assortment of characters to pick from, although not quite what I would call groundbreaking. Throughout the game, you'll play through the usual suspects of a given saga, with the end of most levels resulting in a boss battle reenacting a key fight from the anime. The first level, predictably, shows the iconic battle between Goku and his brother Raditz, which is then followed up by a level having Gohan fight through to a Nappa boss battle. The third level doesn't have a level leading up to the boss, but instead is a self-contained boss battle level between Goku and Vegeta. There are a few missions like this where the whole thing is just a boss battle, but it is effective. We then enter the Ginyu Saga, which is where the game starts to really lean into its own. We open with a very solid Vegeta level that ends in a Raccoon boss, but the follow-up to that is like the Vegeta boss battle, giving us a self-contained fight between Goku, Berter, and Jeice. I actually found this to be one of the harder battles due simply to the tankiness of these characters, but the fact that they incorporated the Seizure Procedure move is pretty cool. A lot of these boss battles are pretty grindy, and it likely explains the unpopularity of this particular title, but I overlooked it because despite its grindy nature, it wasn't very frustrating. This is the case with pretty much every boss battle. As you can clearly see, this game follows the main fights of the show pretty closely because after that, we fight Ginyu as Goku, and then fight Ginyu in Goku's body as Vegeta. Then, there's a few one-off mechanics that felt like odd inclusions, like how in our boss fight between Vegeta and second form Frieza, there's a meter at the top showing how far away Piccolo is from our position. So it's kind of like outlasting a battle we can't win or something, but This mechanic doesn't really get used again, so I don't know why it's here. That's not to say it isn't interesting, but it does feel like a strange inclusion. Things get really interesting when we reach the iconic battle between Super Saiyan Goku and Final Form Frieza. I really do see what they were going for here with this Super Saiyan mechanic being a kind of temporary power boost and all, but I just don't really like it. It makes it feel more like a super attack to be utilized as a quick flurry of hits than a genuine long-term power boost like it should. I did end up getting used to how it works, but I still don't love this execution. Of course, after the Frieza battle is when we play the Yardrat level I mentioned earlier, and like I was saying then, this is a pretty cool idea in my opinion. The design of the planet is unique, and the opponent is an interesting character that we don't really see often in DBZ games. Although canonically, the purpose of this encounter was for Goku to learn instant transmission, and we learned no such technique from this in the game, which makes sense I suppose, because how would that even be implemented into the game? Either way, it's a neat level, and it leads to some of my favorite levels as I talked about earlier, the future timeline, where we play as Trunks fighting his way through the desolate world of an Earth terrorized by powerful androids. Of course, they took some liberties with the addition of these minion androids, but like, whatever, you know? Predictably, the end-level bosses for these missions are just androids 17 and 18 every time, but that's fine. Lastly, we got the proper Android and Cell sagas to finish off the game. It opens with this mission playing as Goku defending different Capsule Corp buildings from hordes of smaller minion androids, which again is silly, but I didn't mind it. When I got to the Vegeta vs Android 19 confrontation though, I did notice something odd. Vegeta's character image depicts him here in his traditional Saiyan Saga armor, but as a Super Saiyan. I find this to be strange because his image has changed before in this game between the Saiyan and Frieza sagas. So why didn't they bother to depict him in his Android Saga armor here? This is a nitpick, sure, but someone clearly bothered to alter his image, making him a Super Saiyan, but they didn't bother to just redraw him and remove the shoulder pads? Not to mention other inaccuracies regarding the armor he's wearing in certain places. Hardly the most egregious issue of the game, but still. One of the most interesting things about this level is that it opens on a boss battle rather than ending on one, starting us off against 19 and then leading to the rest of the level as we chase Gero to his lab. Of course, the next level is a fitting boss-only level against 18, which is pretty easy since by this point in the game, your character will be nearly maxed out with abilities. Right after this, we get another boss-only level as Piccolo has a showdown against Android 17. The further into the game you get, the less typical Collect-A-Thon levels you'll have and the more boss battles you'll have to fight. Demonstrated here, as this boss battle against 17 leads right into a sort of mini-game level where you have to hit a certain number of combos against your opponent before they get them on you. There are only ever 2 of these missions, and both of them reflect the character's training in the Hyperbolic Time Chamber. This is the first of these mini-game missions as we play as Trunks versus Vegeta. It would have been cool if they'd modeled a version of this Trunks with the longer hair and the torn up clothing, but it's still really interesting. Upon beating this minigame mission, we move on to the iconic Super Vegeta vs Semi-Perfect Cell fight, except unlike the Frieza encounter or the 19 encounter, the game does not start us off in our Super Saiyan form here. Not only that, but they didn't give us an Ascended Super Saiyan form transformation here either. I won't hold the lack of another transformation against the developers, but not starting us as a Super Saiyan at least was a misstep for sure. After beating him in his semi-perfect form and progressing through the Collect-A-Thon portion of the level, we get to fight him again in his perfect form just like in the anime. Next up is that second Hyperbolic Time Chamber minigame mission I mentioned earlier, this time depicting Goku and Gohan training. At least they're both in the appropriate attire. Finally, after this, we begin the penultimate level as we fight a group of Cell Juniors as Goku, which was as short-lived in execution as it was in concept. I feel like this mission is kind of a waste, and like we could have gotten a better extra mission somewhere else, but it's not like terrible or anything. With that out of the way, we're on to the final level as we have to push ourselves to achieve the Super Saiyan 2 transformation before we can finally destroy Perfect Cell. At the very least, the Super Saiyan 2 feels powerful and looks awesome, so that's a big plus here. As you're seeing, while in this mode we can maintain it by keeping constant combos on our opponents, and while in this state, you're basically a powerhouse and can just demolish Cell. And that's the story mode of Sagas. It's not the best story mode in a Dragon Ball game, not by a long shot, but I do think it has some redeeming qualities about it. I like the pacing of the story here and all of the additional content portrayed throughout this mode. It's a fun way to enjoy the sagas of the anime. The real benefit of Sagas, however, is the multiplayer mode. Unlike previous Dragon Ball Z games, there is no versus mode available, but is instead replaced by a co-op mode that lets players hop into levels together and play through most of the available missions together. I say most because some of the missions just straight up don't allow for co-op play, but the ones that do manage to keep it somewhat canonical, opting to make the second player someone who makes some kind of sense in story. So like Trunks and Vegeta both fighting Cell, or Gohan and Trunks fighting the androids. For missions that don't allow for co-op play, the game just puts in one player model and sets a timer that switches control of the character between players every 30 seconds. I am not a fan of this. For the levels that do allow for proper co-op play, however, I can see how this would be a fantastic way of experiencing some non-competitive DBZ gaming with your friends back in the day. The gameplay itself has a lot of really overlooked value as well, in my opinion. What you've been seeing on screen is your run-of-the-mill beat-em-up gameplay. That much is true. You've got your basic melee button mashing with some unlockable combos to spice it all up over time. Then your energy attacks offer a ranged element along with the iconic special attacks from the series like the Kamehameha Wave, Gallic Gun, Burning Attack, and more. The combat isn't what makes this game so special to me though, but rather the Collect-A-Thon element in between. Admittedly, calling this game a Collect-A-Thon is a massive stretch, so if you came to comment that this barely qualifies as a genuine Collect-A-Thon, I'm here to tell you that I agree with you. However, it does just reinforce my point that I think the idea of a Dragon Ball Z Collect-A-Thon is genuinely a promising one. Because I was having a great time messing around with the gameplay here. The movement is reliable and responsive once you kind of get the hang of it, and I was really enjoying moving around the maps and finding different capsules hidden throughout the area. That being said, there are a few issues. Most of the maps are fun to play, but are just way too small. Again, they feel a bit lazy and needed way more size and diversity in their layout. The flight, though, is such a great mechanic and is implemented in such a way to make it a prime puzzle and platforming tool that ends up being totally underutilized. Seriously, in the earlier levels of the game, you had to find different ways to use your flight in order to collect certain Z tokens or capsules. Later levels, however, ended up just dropping this idea all but outright. Each level needed way more platforming and puzzle solving. Which is weird coming from me, given I don't normally like too much of those mechanics, but I could have stood more of it here. What we got feels super bare bones and boring, not to mention small and linear. These levels could have benefited immensely with some larger areas a la Ratchet & Clank or Banjo-Kazooie or something. Even the Sly Cooper games would have made a great reference, more open movement where possible. Because the maps we did get were really fun to play with, they just left a lot to be desired in terms of content because of their extreme linearity and lack of exploration. The fun here isn't enough to make up for the lackluster beat-em-up combat either, although what we have isn't bad in my opinion, it is certainly limited, which is how I would describe a lot of this game actually. It's all very limited. The upgrade system is one of the only bits of the game that lets you participate in a dynamic way with its world by deciding which abilities to upgrade first. These will be crucial in overcoming the different obstacles of this game's world, and I love that it's actually reliant on the player collecting the various Z tokens littered around the world. It feels like a great way to tie it all together, although by the middle of the game you'll have unlocked all of the most important abilities and can just focus on grabbing up the remaining combos. These combos are more important than I first realized because your base damage output is pathetic, so you will be relying on these by the end of it. When you take everything I've talked about here and put it together, the result is a very unique but flawed take on adapting the Dragon Ball Z storyline to the video game medium. If you're a big fan of the series or have a high tolerance for half-baked mechanics in favor of novel ideas, both of which describe me, then you'll probably have a pretty fun time with this one, especially if you can get a friend to sit down with you for an evening and just run through it for fun. It's not the best Dragon Ball Z game, hell it's not even close, but it is particularly unprecedented in a lot of ways that make it worth checking out if only to experience its unusual takes on the franchise that inspired it. The story mode of Dragon Ball Z Sagas is its most compelling offering by far, but those of you who see it through to the end will be rewarded with an unlockable mode called Pendulum. This mode simply allows you to replay any of the levels you've previously unlocked, but as any of the existing playable characters, of which there are a couple of very interesting choices. You can go in and play any level as Goku in any of the outfits you see him wearing in-game, including his Saiyan armor from the Hyperbolic Time Chamber mode. Or you can play as any of the multiple Trunks variations in any of the levels. If you decide you feel like it, you can always embody the one-armed Gohan of the Dark Future timeline. But the best choices are the two movie characters that failed to appear in the main story mode. First up, of course, is Bardock, the father of Goku, who has his own attack animations for him specifically, which left me wondering if there was a point in this game's development when they were considering having a level before the main game where you played as Bardock. If that was ever the case, then I severely lament that ever having been cut, as it would have been awesome to play a level like that. Then you've got the other, smaller players like Tien, Krillin, or Yamcha, and of course, yes, you've got Broly. No idea why he's here, but he is very noticeably the strongest character in the game. He's a hulking Goliath of intimidation and pain, and I don't think there's another game out there offering an experience to play as Broly in a setting like this. Not to mention they even bother to color his attacks green like from the movie, which I love. It's one of the more shallow bonus modes I've covered in a Dragon Ball game before, but at the very least, it is fun and offers you certain experiences you quite literally cannot find anywhere else. Okay, now normally this would be where I do a compare and contrast of the different regions' cover arts, but because Sagas was developed in the US, it only ever got one cover art, so that's the one I'm going to be looking at today. I'd say it's on the better end of the DBZ cover arts I've looked at so far. A white background depicts various iconic battles from the manga, with a fully colored rendition of Super Saiyan Goku powering up front and center. The game's logo hovers above his head, providing the only other splash of color on the screen. This is a really simple cover art, but I think it's effective enough. It follows a sort of rule of three principle, with the two logos and Goku being the main colorful images on the screen. I like it overall and think it's more than fitting enough for the game as is. It's not the best cover art I've seen, nor is it the worst. A solid, attention-grabbing image with a style all its own. As for the music, I'm happy to say we are controversy-free with this one. No plagiarism accusations of any kind. The music of Sagas is all unique and original, but it's also somewhat mysterious as I have no idea who composed it. I tried to locate the composer for this game and came up totally empty-handed, so if you have any idea who wrote all of this, then please leave a comment with whatever info you have. The genre here is interesting. Being developed by a Western studio, I would have expected them to try replicating the feel of the US score by Mike Smith, Scott Morgan, Julius Dobos, and the other guys over at Faulkner Productions at the time, but the music of Sagas actually sounds kind of like a hybrid between the Japanese score and the US one. Some of the tracks kind of resemble the US music, relying on heavy synth work with guitar, bass, and drums throughout, but the chord progressions tend to feel more like something you'd hear in the Japanese dub. It's all competent, and there's plenty of fans who love the soundtrack of this game, but I was personally not a huge fan of it. I found it to be repetitive and severely lacking when compared to the music of other DBZ games available at the time. I can't quite put my finger on it, but even the most intense tracks of the score feel nearly void of any real intensity. Listening to it feels like you just found an old instrumental rock and roll album from the 70s, and not like the background music for battling galactic tyrants and synthetic abominations. It's well produced and features some stellar lead guitar work on certain parts, but overall, I just was not a fan of any of the tracks on offer here. Kind of a letdown in my opinion, as with some more appropriate music, a lot of these levels could have felt far more intense. Even a better score probably wouldn't have been enough to save this game though. Sagas released to a unanimously disappointing reception. It was showered in negative reviews and considered a critical and commercial failure. I don't have the numbers on exactly how many copies it sold, but it certainly was not enough to warrant pursuit of a sequel. The game's lack of content, gameplay, characters, and movesets were all major points of criticism, with IGN calling the game a step backwards for the Dragon Ball Z franchise. The game currently holds a 48 on Metacritic for the GameCube release, and a 49 for the PS2 version, which is pretty abysmal for a game based on such a popular brand. The Xbox version of the game was received better than the PS2 and GameCube at the very least, with a score of 51. It's not hard to understand why people who bought this game back in the day would have had some major issues with it, and I wouldn't blame anyone who dropped the controller before finishing it and never picked it back up. But looking back on it in retrospect, however, I find myself feeling more lenient towards the game's many flaws, as I was enjoying the ambitious new ideas that remained specific to this title. I can actually remember many years ago being a child when I got this game for my birthday. My mom even bought me this cool Dragon Ball Z fighting game joypad for the PS2. I'd never seen anything quite like it, and I lugged that thing around for years, I'll tell you. It was better for the Budokai games than it was for this game, but you know I used it for SAGAS anyway. Honestly, Dragon Ball Z SAGAS is an objectively poor video game, not to mention a little bit frustrating before you get over the learning curve. That being said, it can become satisfying to play with time in spite of its repetitive nature. A Collect-A-Thon DBZ game is a great idea in my opinion, and the parts that do play well are pretty fun. The parts that don't play well are pretty easy to get over. If you're just looking to have a good time, then this game can be a rewarding experience. This is the perfect kind of game for DBZ fans to pick up for cheap, have a few drinks with a friend, and just run through the co-op mode on a Friday night or something. Although maybe nothing about this game has really caught your interest, and you're not thrilled about the idea of wasting your time on a mediocre, licensed PS2 game from 2005. Well, if that is the case, then don't worry, as I can confirm, you're really not missing much. There's plenty of much better Dragon Ball games out there to try after all. But if you're a Dragon Ball fan, and there were some ideas on display here that interested you in giving the experience a shot, then I genuinely do believe that Dragon Ball Z SAGAS might be worth a night or two of your time. Hey, thanks so much for watching, everyone. I've been excited about covering this particular game since I started on my script for Budokai 1, so finally getting to run through it was a nostalgia-ridden thrill ride for me. If you have any memories of this one, then drop a comment about your experiences. Not only do I love reading those, but every comment helps my channel a lot. I'd ask that you like the video as well and subscribe if you haven't already, because I've got plenty more Dragon Ball content on the horizon. Members of the channel get access to most of my videos a week or two before their public release, access to additional posts and polls, and my previous live streams for retroactive viewing. Thanks again to everyone for watching, and I can't wait to see you on the next video. Until then, that's all I've got for you.